Module 4. Lesson 4. PHP Frameworks. A web framework or web application framework is a software framework that is designed to support the development of web applications including web services, web resources, and web APIs. Web frameworks provide a standard way to build and deploy web applications on the World Wide Web. Web frameworks aim to automate the overhead associated with common activities performed in web development. For example, many web frameworks provide libraries for database access, templating frameworks, and session management, and they often promote code reuse. Although they often target development of dynamic websites, they are also applicable to static websites. PHP has been the dominating development language for creating dynamic websites in the last decades. Today, content management systems, called shortly CMS, like WordPress, Joomla, Drupal or services like Facebook, are all developed using the PHP language. One of the main reasons for PHP popularity is because it is open source. Another reason would be the easy deployment and integration of PHP on any operating system and the fact that PHP will run relatively fast on all operating systems. Furthermore, the easy and C-like syntax would attract many developers working with web development and also the huge built-in and external development libraries available for use by third-party developers. Take some time and check the packages.org website. Of course, we have to mention some drawbacks of PHP that a developer should have in mind. A thing anybody would recognize when reviewing the PHP documentation is the mixing of programming paradigms in the development libraries. Some of the libraries are written using the procedural concept, others use the object-oriented design. This behavior can also be found when reviewing source code of any randomly selected PHP application not developed using a framework. Secondly, issues like security has been a subject of concern in the PHP community since the beginning. Generally, the security vulnerabilities in web applications of any kind are still a big issue. PHP provides the developers with many built-in libraries containing concrete implementations regarding the validation and sanitization of any kinds of input. These are the most easy security issues to handle, but when dealing with security vulnerabilities like cross-site scripting, XSS, cross-site request forgery, CSRF, session and cookie hijacking, PHP does not provide any concrete fixes to deal with these kinds of attacks. The developer has to make her own implementation or use third-party libraries to deal with these kinds of issues. According to W3Text.com, PHP is the most common used scripting language on the web. Powering about 80% of all web application, it would be unreal to code each of them from scratch, as coding in PHP more often becomes repetitive or monotonous. Web developers utilize various frameworks and tools to speed up repetitive tasks. PHP has many frameworks under its hood helping the developers to simplify the web development by offering more secure and versatile policies, eventually reducing the complexity of coding. A PHP framework provides a basic structure for streamlining the development of web apps and speeds up the development process. Generally, a PHP framework is an implementation layer upon PHP and it encapsulates some architectural patterns, principles and other implementations solving different problems. Example of architectural designs used is the Model View Controller, the well-known MVC, for which the purpose is to separate presentation of a web page from the business logic. Another common architectural pattern is the active record pattern, which is simply an abstraction technique in which implemented objects are mapped to their source of persistence. The general benefits of using PHP frameworks are rapid application development, organized and reusable code, Scalability of web applications. Separation of presentation and logic, under MVC pattern. Relevant practices and tools. Moreover, common software development principles and paradigms that a PHP framework encapsulate are. Don't repeat yourself. This is probably the single most fundamental tenet in programming, to avoid repetition. Many programming constructs exist solely for that purpose, for example loops, functions, classes, and more. As soon as you start repeating yourself, for example a long expression, a series of statements, same concept, create a new abstraction. Keep it simple, stupid, simplicity, and avoiding complexity, should always be a key goal. Simple code takes less time to write, has fewer bugs, and is easier to modify. Convention over configuration. It is a software design paradigm used by software frameworks that attempts to decrease the number of decisions that a developer using the framework is required to make without necessarily losing flexibility. For example, if there is a class sales in the model, the corresponding table in the database is called sales by default. It is only if one deviates from this convention, such as the table product sales, that one needs to write code regarding these names. By applying these principles and paradigms, a developer is spending less or no time working on configuration. Reusability of the code is obvious and the implementation structure is well preserved. Examples of other implementations that a framework may include are CSRF protection, session and cookie hijacking, and even authentication and authorization components. When we talk about PHP frameworks, the general idea is about Model View Controller. In other words, when you wish to separate the business logic from the web UI and program them separately, then you go with MVC. In simple terms, PHP MVC frameworks break down the development process into modules. As a result, the web developers can work on individual modules without affecting the others. Model View Controller is a pattern that consisting of three different types of classes. Model is the central component of the pattern. The model is responsible for managing the data of the application, often stored in databases. It is the application's dynamic data structure, independent of the user interface, while it receives user input from the controller. View classes manages how the data should be shown to the user. Any representation of information such as a web page, a chart, a diagram or a table is a view. Multiple views of the same information are possible, such as a bar chart for management and a tabular view for accountants. The controller responds to the user input, optionally validates it, and converts it to commands for the model or view classes. Controller classes are the middleware components, collecting data from model and making the data readable before sending it to the view classes. An example of a web page with MVC could be a news page. A user uses a web browser to access the website, which connects to the controller as seen in point 1. Controller needs data from the database, so it will call a function in the model class, as seen in point 2. The model connects to the database and handles the queries, and it returns the data to the controller as seen in point 3. Controller then contacts and retrieves view, as seen in point 4, that mostly contains HTML and only uses PHP to loop out the data and returns it to the user, as seen in point 1. In addition to dividing the application into these components, the Model View Controller design defines the interactions between them. As with other software patterns, MVC expresses the core of the solution to a problem while allowing it to be adapted for each system. Particular MVC designs can vary significantly from the traditional description here. Have you ever been in the situation where you are ready to start a new project but are overwhelmed by the framework options to choose from? How do you know which one to pick? Which will be the quickest to get up and running? Which one is the best to pick long term? Are there any costs associated? Many developers find themselves wondering the same things. Unfortunately, there is no one-size-fits-all answer. The right framework for you will depend on many different factors that you need to consider before making your decision. By taking the time to research your options ahead of time and taking into account the following considerations, hopefully the answer will become clear and you will end up with a well-designed, easy to maintain, and cost-effective solution. New web and especially PHP development frameworks are sprouting out at a more rapid pace than anyone could keep up with. In the following slides, we are going to outline the various aspects you should be concerned about before choosing a framework for creating your next, hot web application. Before you even start looking at a framework, you will need to make a list of your requirements and whether a framework is suitable for that purpose. You need a framework if your application is primarily based on CRUD operations. You need a framework if you need to separate the UI and underlying logic, but you do not have the time to implement a proper system. Finally, you need a framework if you find yourself having a self-made library you use in each of your applications covering user authentication, sessions and other usual operations associated with creating a web application. On the other hand, you don't need a framework when your application is simple and static. If you want a pretty URL system alone, if you want only a specific part of the framework like its ORM. Finally, you don't need a framework if you are on a tight timeline and you need to learn the framework from scratch. Before you start developing with a framework, see what kind of license the framework is distributed under. The last thing you would want is to create an entire application only to find out that the license does not allow you to distribute it commercially. Do note that this is not limited to the framework alone. The plugins or extensions you made use of for the extra functionality may have a hidden clause. Check their licenses too. If you must pay, is the licensing cost worth any savings you might have down the road, either in development time or maintenance time? A framework that is open source generally means that while there is no formal support, there are more people helping to maintain the code. More people to maintain the code means there is less chance of it becoming stagnant as long as enough people are using it. Be sure to consider the velocity of contributions to the framework, though. If the open source framework does not have many recent commits, the framework is in danger of being stagnant. Almost every PHP framework out there exclusively uses the MVC pattern that we have presented. However, there will be new architecture patterns that may better match your development needs, so keep it in mind. You have to consider the benefits of the pattern, especially the ability for developers to work on separate pieces individually, easy maintenance, for example rewrite or modify presentation layer without having to make changes to the application layer, and module replacing in order to switch out technologies down the road if needed. Ease of installation plays a very important role whilst choosing a framework. Even if the framework provides modern features, can pose quite a problem if one has to run through a number of steps just to get it installed and working. This will also pose a big problem once the application is ready, tested and needs to be deployed to the production server. For a lot of the frameworks, setup is as simple as setting the right values in the configuration file, whilst for others it may be a very time-consuming, elaborate affair. Choose a framework which lets you get up and running as rapidly as possible. Every framework has its own naming conventions, directory structures, etc. Some frameworks are rather flexible with these, while others are very strict, throwing up errors at the tiniest of mistakes. Some frameworks follow general conventions while implementing a feature, while others may do it their way. While choosing a framework, remember to choose one that has a small learning curve. If you don't know the language the framework is written in, then you have to include the language itself to the learning curve. If you need to learn both the framework and the language, it is hard enough. It is for the core library that most developers adopt a framework. The library should free you from writing repetitive code but still provide a way for you to tinker with it if you need more control or features. Most frameworks offer libraries which cover features like AJAX, authentication, authorization, caching, data sanitization, data validation, templating and URL mapping or rewriting. Of course, not everyone needs a framework brimming with features. A lot of people prefer frameworks to handle the bare minimum whilst letting the developer handle the rest. In these cases, you'll need to make sure the framework in question has only the features you need. A current trend among frameworks is that they are created as a library of libraries. In other words, it lets you swap out parts of the library with another part of your choice. Almost every web application has to access a database to either read data off or edit its contents. Either way, you will be doing this several times across the application, and most frameworks provide a database access class you can make a use of. So while choosing a framework, choose one which lets your application become database agnostic. Then, you will never have to care about the database part in case you need to switch out databases. The second part you will need to think about is the framework's ORM capabilities. Object Relational Mapping, ORM, in computer science is a programming technique for converting data between incompatible type systems using object-oriented programming languages. This creates, in effect, a virtual object database that can be used from within the programming language. There are both free and commercial packages available that perform object relational mapping, although some programmers opt to construct their own ORM tools. In object-oriented programming, data management tasks act on objects that are almost always non-scalar values. For example, an address book entry that represents a single person along with 0 or more phone numbers and 0 or more addresses. This could be modeled in an object-oriented implementation by a person object with attributes to hold each data item that the entry comprises, the person's name, a list of phone numbers, and a list of addresses. The list of phone numbers would itself contain phone number objects and so on. The address book entry is treated as a single object by the programming language. For instance, it can be referenced by a single variable containing a pointer to the object. Various methods can be associated with the object, such as a method to return the preferred phone number, the home address, and so on. However, many popular database products such as SQL database management systems can only store and manipulate scalar values such as integers and strings organized within tables. The programmer must either convert the object values into groups of simpler values for storage in the database, and convert them back upon retrieval, or only use simple scalar values within the program. Object relational mapping implements the first approach. The heart of the problem involves translating the logical representation of the objects into an atomized form that is capable of being stored in the database while preserving the properties of the objects and their relationships so that they can be reloaded as objects when needed. If this storage and retrieval functionality is implemented, the objects are said to be persistent. Almost all PHP frameworks have ORM capabilities. Doctrine is a general open-source ORM for PHP, which is popular nowadays. One of Doctrine's key features is the option to write database queries in Doctrine query language, called DQL, an object-oriented dialect of SQL. Another point of contention is the bundled JavaScript library. While most libraries let you swap out the library with ease, the AJAX methods inside the framework are mostly still aimed towards a specific JavaScript library. This implicitly means that you'll have to manually write the functionality yourself. On the other hand are frameworks with library-agnostic methods which let you swap out the JavaScript library with little to no hassle. Wikipedia defines unit testing as the software testing method by which individual units of source code, sets of one or more computer program modules together with associated control data, usage procedures, and operating procedures, are tested to determine whether they are fit for use. Unit testing can save you a headache by catching issues before you notice them causing problems. If a framework already has built-in unit testing, this can save you a lot of time and trouble. Frameworks which let developers write unit tests are a definite plus in this case. A lot of frameworks including CodeIgniter, CakePHP and Zend lets you create custom tests in addition to the core tests to check the critical parts of your application. A framework's documentation is often key to its success. Well-explained, detailed documentation draws in the power users who then bring in more people. With shoddy, confusing documentation, people are going to just walk off confused and annoyed. The more popular a framework is, the more likely you are going to find good documentation available for your use. Good documentation can save you a lot of time both in the setup time and when you run into issues during development. Make sure you spend some time seeing how easy it is to find solutions to potential issues. Look for a framework which has thorough documentation with plenty of examples, snippets, sample code, articles and tutorials. Inevitably, even with proper documentation, you are going to run into errors to rectify which, you are going to have to ask the community behind the framework for help. As often is the case, the communities behind a framework make or break the framework. Too few and too snobby and you will hate the framework instead of the people. Large community and well-mannered and you'll gravitate towards the framework. Choose a framework which has a friendly community which helps developers new to the platform. Determining how new the framework is may give you a good idea of how much longer the framework will be around. A newer framework may be around for a good while if it ends up being a successful framework. But too new and it will be harder to find support when you have issues, and there may be items that haven't been tested sufficiently. Conversely, make sure the framework hasn't been around so long that it is stagnant or close to it. You don't want to be in a situation where a year after you've finished development, the framework stops providing updates and security patches. Your best bet is to find a middle ground. Look for a framework that has been around long enough to be tested, but not so old that you're concerned it's at the end of its life. One of the reasons web developers do not create their own frameworks is the fact that they alone are in charge of fixing the bugs and updates. With a big framework, you literally have thousands of programmers sifting through the code and putting it through its paces on a daily basis. Bugs, if and when they are found, are squashed as soon as possible. Choose a framework which isn't stagnant. You don't want a hacker to tell you that a security vulnerability exists in the framework through a page he hacked on your site. You'd rather hear that from the framework developers, hopefully with a link to a patch to the issue. Choose a framework which is updated often, is open about the bugs it finds and more importantly fixes the bugs people come across as soon as possible. While a framework covers all of the important basic components of an application, you'll still have to write some code. Make it generic enough and you can repurpose it into a component suitable for reuse in your other applications, or even better, release it to the general public so they make use of it in their applications. Choose a framework which lets you extend the framework easily and with minimal fuss. With CakePHP, for example, extending a controller is taken care of by components and views by helpers. In either case, creating an extension is as simple as defining a new class which inherits from a parent base class. While choosing a framework, also keep in mind the availability of plugins. Often you won't have the time to create a custom extension from scratch. However, keep in mind to choose not by the number of extensions but by the quality of the extensions. When you look at a project over its entire lifetime, the percentage of time spent on maintenance, like fixing existing issues, preventative maintenance, optimizing code, is typically 60 to 80%. This is a huge chunk of time compared to the initial development. The more people use the framework, the more unit testing there is, the better the documentation is, the number of staff members who know the framework, the simpler this will be. Your project maintenance will most likely continue for years and years after the initial development completes. It is obvious that there are many areas you should consider before selecting a web development framework to use. For different people and businesses, each consideration may hold different weight. A framework that is the best option for one person may not be the best option for another. Taking the time to research before you make your decision can save you money and time of development and maintenance. Many frameworks based on PHP popped up during the last decade. They have emerged and evolved in order to offer developers the ability to build more complex, secure, and well-rounded web applications faster than ever before. Frameworks for PHP come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and have targeted developers with different levels of experience, application needs, hosting capabilities, and development timeframes. Framework selection is an important step because the speed and quality of the work depends on it. You can find many articles on how to choose an appropriate PHP framework for your task. We will outline here the results of a great study in 2020, carried out by coderseye.com. This survey queried subscribers on in-depth questions such as specific uses of authentication, session coding, caching methods, and routing. In this section we provide a short description and a summary of advantages and disadvantages for 5 PHP frameworks. The most popular PHP frameworks according to Google Trends, showing what users are looking for in Google, are Laravel, Symfony and CodeIgniter. Moreover, we have included Zend, because its popularity in enterprise, and Falcon, because of its best performance. Laravel is the number one of the list. It's a comprehensive framework designed for rapidly building applications using the MVC architecture. Laravel was first released in 2011 and it is currently the most popular PHP framework, with a huge community of developers. It features tons of Laravel-specific packages, the lightweight Blade templating engine, unit testing, ORM, a packaging system, RESTful controllers, and now Laravel is the first framework to introduce routing in an abstract way. Queue management is also a feature that handles tasks in the background and then logs the activity, while tasks are normally run in the front end. With a robust composer built into Laravel, packages can be easily added. One of the best things Laravel handles well are NoSQL structures like MongoDB or Redis. It's easy to get started with Laravel thanks to its extensive documentation, popularity, and Laravel Udemy, which is a popular video and tutorial site, meant to get developers new to Laravel up and running. Laravel recently came out with Nova, a beautiful administration panel designed for productive developers that want to come up with new creations and still stay productive. The main advantages of Laravel over the other frameworks are: well-organizing of files and code, support for rapid application development, support the construction of your application on MVC architecture, supports the PHP unit testing framework in the core of the framework, PHP Unit is one of the most popular and widely accepted testing frameworks across the PHP community. It allows you to create both kinds of tests, unit and functional. Unit testing allows to test your class's models, controllers etc., while feature testing enables you to test your codebase. Moreover, Laravel comes with the best and complete documentation of any other framework. Supports high level of abstraction and overloading capabilities using dynamic methods. Provides developers with tons of out-of-the-box functionality. Supports payment integration with Stripe. Comes with very strong packages for encryption. Finally, it supports the object relational mapping programming technique. When coming to the disadvantages of Laravel, we could mention these. It does not work on shared hosting plans of your web server. It is not as fast as other frameworks, because of the many queries requests on your database. Falcon is a MVC-based PHP framework, uniquely built as a PHP extension written in C, meaning it's absolutely blazing fast. Falcon uses very few resources in comparison to other frameworks, translating into very fast processing of HTTP requests, which can be critical for developers working with systems that do not offer much overhead. The code is compiled to specific platform and processor. Thanks to its low-level architecture and optimizations, Falcon provides the lowest performance for MVC-based applications. Falcon has been actively developed since 2012, and includes ORM, MVC, caching, and auto-loading components. Its latest and first long-term support release includes support for PHP 7. Falcon brings developers data storage tools such as its own SQL dialect, PHQL, as well as object document mapping for MongoDB. Other features include template engines, form builders, ease of building applications with international language support, and more. Falcon is ideal for building both performance REST API, as well as full-fledged web applications. The main advantages of Falcon over the other frameworks are: unlike other frameworks, Falcon optimizes performance due to its sufficient memory utilization. If you're looking to create a blazing fast website, give Falcon a try. It is by far the faster framework regarding the server response with very low overheads, meaning low memory and CPU consumption. It allows loading project classes automatically, based on some predefined rules. By loading classes on a need-to-load basis, the overall performance is increased since the only file reads that occur are for the files needed. This technique is called lazy initialization. Falcon is unique in that it is built as a C extension, meaning that the code is compiled and faster. Falcon supports some very good security features. Its documentation is plenty enough and complete for the developers. Finally, Falcon is a friendly framework for the developers as it is easy to install and suitable for creating highly configurable web applications that are in line with enterprise development guidelines. When coming to the disadvantages of Falcon, we could mention these. Not as open source as Laravel. Falcon developers are a bit slow to patch bugs, which may not jive with today's need for high levels of security. Does not work with Hip Hop Virtual Machine, which is an open-source virtual machine based on just-in-time compilation. CodeIgniter is one of the early PHP frameworks. The first version was released in the beginning of 2006. The man behind CodeIgniter is Rick Ellis, a rock musician turned into programmer. The reason for developing CodeIgniter is because Rick Ellis was disappointed with at times available PHP frameworks. He was particularly disappointed with issues like terrible documentation, high learning curve, complicated deployment and the usage of terminal commands. MVC pattern and C-like object orientation are recognizable techniques in the framework when using it at the first time. CodeIgniter is an ideal framework for rapid application development. It is a lightweight, low-hassle, Framework with a small footprint that can be installed just by uploading it directly to your hosting. No special command line or software installation is required. Upload the files and you are ready to go. Building full-fledged web applications is a breeze with its small learning curve and numerous libraries. CodeIgniter's documentations is extensive, and its community is vast and very helpful. It is backed by an academic entity as well, the British Columbia Institute of Technology, which will help ensure its continued development and growth. Feature-wise, CodeIgniter comes with many built-in libraries for unit testing, form validation, email, sessions, and more. If you cannot find a library you are looking for, it is also easy to build your own, and then share it with the community. The main advantages of CodeIgniter over the other frameworks are: it is very developer-friendly, as CodeIgniter does not need any special dependencies or support. Due to a simple setup process and highly illustrated documentation, it's ideal for beginners. With CodeIgniter you are able to use normal web hosting services well, while using standard databases such as MySQL. It outperforms most other frameworks that does not support the MVC architecture pattern. Finally, CodeIgniter comes with a good documentation and a community that guarantees long-term support. When coming to the disadvantages of CodeIgniter, we could mention these. It doesn't use namespaces because it is written to support PHP 4. It is not as friendly towards unit testing as others. There are few libraries that are built inside the framework. CodeIgniter releases are a bit irregular, so the framework isn't a great option for an application that requires high-level security. Symfony is one of the early PHP frameworks, created by Fabian Potencier in 2005. Symfony has been touted for a while now as a very stable, high-performance, well-documented, and modular project. Symfony is backed by the French Sensio Labs and has been developed by them and its community to be a fantastic framework. Symfony is used by many big-name companies like the BBC and open-source projects such as Drupal and Easy Publish. Symfony was written with stability in mind in a very professional way. Its documentation is extensive, and its community is just as vast. It is used for building both performance REST APIs, as well as full-fledged web applications. The main advantages of Symfony over the other frameworks are: high performance, due to bytecode caching. It is stable, mature and well supported. Provides built-in implementations for sanitization, validation and security vulnerability protection. Finally, it is well documented. When coming to the disadvantages of Symfony, we could mention these: while the documentation is good, there is a steep learning curve. Symfony targets advanced developers and is a bit harder to start with. While companies are moving to MVC framework architectures, Symfony 2 or later does not support MVC architecture pattern. Zend framework is a popular, go-to professional framework commonly used for high-performance enterprise-level applications. Zend is built with security, performance, and extensibility in mind. Because of its focus for enterprise applications, it has tons of components for authentication, feeds, forms, services and more. Because of its enterprise-driven nature, Zend isn't ideal for rapid application development, though it does come with tools to make a developer's life easier, including Zend's proprietary IDE, Zend Studio, which neatly integrates with Zend framework. The main advantages of Zend over the other frameworks are: it is the best framework for the development of complex enterprise applications. It is fully object-oriented. Zend community provides tons of components for validation, feeds, and forms. Finally, Zend's loosely coupled architecture facilitates the integration with existing architectures. When coming to the disadvantages of Zen, we could mention these: it is not good for rapid application development. Even if its documentation is good, there is a steep and long learning curve. Overall, each of these can best be put into categories of independent libraries, full-fledged PHP frameworks for fully featured web applications, and micro-frameworks, suitable for keeping things simple and building RESTful APIs or basic web apps. Ultimately, it will be up to you as a developer to decide which one is the best fit for your project and/or your skills. Deciding on which framework to use depends on a variety of factors. You consider aspects such as speed, ease of use, available features, documentation, and the dependencies or hosting resources it requires. Scalability should also be considered, if you expect growth that exceeds the capacity of a single instance of your application. Although Laravel takes first overall on our list for long-term support, size of community and contributors, and versatility, Falcon is a close second, and it is by far the faster PHP framework. Regarding the response time of a request, one of the only reasons it comes in second is that it hasn't taken off in the web development community as much or as fast as Laravel. Always be sure to check out the community or company behind the development of each framework to make sure it is actively maintained and preferably has long-term support, LTS, which will ensure it remains updated and supported for the future. This was a brief introduction to PHP frameworks and what you should have in mind when choosing the most appropriate for your project. Please, study 2 or 3 of them and try to code a web application of your own by using them. Remember, coding can be fun.